Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Syrett.
On this episode, the strange paranormal case of a talking mongoose witnessed by a family living on the Isle of Mann and several other paranormal investigators.
At first, Gef refused to talk. He created some poltergeist activity. He'd rapped on the walls, he threw things. Eventually, though, Gef did start to talk, and McDonald recorded a number of accounts of hearing Gef talk. Oftentimes, when all three members of the family were with him so he could keep a close eye on them. Other times, they would send Vori out of the house, say like out into the barnyard to gather chicken eggs. Gef still persisted in talking.
This podcast is brought to you by Paranormal Contractors. You would be shocked to know how many people are experiencing some kind of paranormal activity in their home or business, perhaps even some kind of spirit oppression. It's not something that's discussed in public for fear of ridicule, but it is happening. Maybe it's happening to you or someone you care about. Make no mistake, this is a serious matter. And my good friends at Paranormal Contractors treat it with the seriousness it deserves. Paranormal Contractors is a division of crime and trauma scene cleaners. They'll come to your home with the latest and the best technology to investigate, authenticate, and remediate your ghost or demon problem. Why not put your mind at rest and take that first step? Call them at 1-866-724-0800. 1-866-724-0800. Or email them at paranormalcontractors@gmail.com and tell them Richard sent you. Check out their YouTube channel, Paranormal Contractors, for things that go bump in the night. Welcome to your Monday. This is truly one of the most bizarre stories I've heard in many years, 27 years in fact, first as a talk radio producer. Author, TV producer Tim Swartz is standing by with the details on Gef the Talking Mongoose. Wait till you hear this, folks. We had what I hope is one final blast of winter up here in Thornhill Saturday night. A little bit of snow, a little bit of rain, as I headed into the studio to host Coast to Coast. And of course, I had my summer tires put on last week. It seems I never learn. And we enjoyed some baseball on TV this weekend with the Blue Jays' home opening series against the Detroit Tigers. And the boys and I are planning a road trip this spring. We're on a mission to see a baseball game in all 30 major league parks. And we're going to try and get to games in Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh sometime in May if the scheduling works out. We're just getting started. We've been to games in Toronto, of course, Yankee Stadium, and Comerica Park in Detroit. And we'll tick 3 more off the list this spring, and then just 24 more to go. Looking forward to it. Hey, please say hi if you're from Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, or Cleveland, and let me know which hotels we should stay in, preferably something close to the ballpark. The email is richardsarrett1@gmail.com. Well, it's a genuine historical mystery, a modern-day monster story, a true miracle of nature. Of course, animals can't talk, but this one apparently did. And he did a lot more. He sang songs. He mimicked other animals and sounds. He could read minds. He was able to move objects through the air, although he was nowhere near them. He chatted with visitors from around the world, sometimes using vulgar language. But they couldn't see him because he said he could become invisible whenever he wanted to, all the time living in the walls of a remote farmhouse located on the windswept coast of the Isle of Mann. Here to tell us the story is Tim R. Swartz. He's an Indiana native and Emmy-Award winning television producer and videographer, and is the author of a number of popular books, including The Lost Journals of Nikola Tesla, America's Strange and Supernatural History, UFO Repeaters, Time Travel, Fact or Fiction, Men of Mystery, Nikola Tesla, and many others. As a photojournalist, Tim has traveled extensively and investigated paranormal phenomena and other unusual mysteries from such diverse locations as the Great Pyramid in Egypt to the Great Wall of China. His latest book is Gef the Talking Mongoose, the 8th Wonder of the World. Tim Swartz, welcome to Conspiracy Unlimited. How are you?
I'm doing great, Richard. Thank you very much for having me on today.
Gef the Talking Mongoose, the 8th Wonder of the World. This story goes back a long ways, but even for you personally, I mean, you first heard about this story, which I'm not familiar with. I think you were in like middle school or something, weren't you?
Yeah, I was probably around 12 years old, and I bought a paperback book at the drugstore. I mean, remember when you could actually buy paperback books, nonfiction, that dealt with the paranormal? It was called Between Two Worlds, and it was written by a parapsychologist by the name of Nandor Fodor. I love that name. And he had included his investigation into Gef the Talking Mongoose in this book, and it had been taken from an even earlier book that he had written. And when Dr. Fodor had investigated Gef, it was really on the trailing end of the whole phenomena. I think he went there around 1935, 1936. And, the phenomena had actually been going on since 1931. So, I mean, it was already old news by the time Fodor got around to looking into it.
And so you went back to, as best you could, original sources, original notes, even a journal. There's a journal that was kept by a James Irving, who had this gentleman's farm on the Isle of Mann. Tell me about this journal. How did you find it?
Sure. Well, what had happened is that both myself and my publisher, Timothy Green Beckley, have long been fascinated about this case. And with the exception of, say, like Dr. Fodor's writings, most of the information has really been hard to come by. Tim Beckley was able to find somebody who had an original copy of Harry Price's book called The Haunting of Cashin's Gap. And from this book was where we were able to get the majority of James Irving's diary, his daily musings on the whole Gef experience. Now, Harry Price put this book out in, I think it was 1936. It sold barely 400 copies and was never reprinted. So this was an extremely rare book to find. Tim Beckley found somebody who had a copy who was kind enough to scan it for us. And so we were able to look into a lot of information that really hasn't seen the light of day since its original printing. Now, as well, I had friends, since I did not have the luxury of being able to travel to London. I had friends who lived in London who were able to go to various libraries and archives and look up a lot of this original information, the actual papers themselves, and they were able to take notes and send them back to me. So that's the beautiful thing about this book, is that there's a lot of information contained within it that a lot of people have not seen since they were originally written back in the 1930s.
So let's talk about the Irving family, who are at the center of this. How did they, just give us the backstory on how James and his wife, was it Margaret? Yes, Margaret yes. Irving ended up owning this gentleman's farm on the Island of Mann.
James Irving and his wife originally lived in Liverpool, England. Now, James was a piano organ salesman, and obviously a pretty good one at that, because they were fairly well-to-do. Jim was well-educated. He spoke several languages, and up until World War I, his business really prospered. During the war, he found it more and more difficult to make his sales. So him and his wife decided that they were going to buy this farm that they had run across on the Isle of Mann, which is an island that sits in between England and Ireland. Margaret had family that lived on the island, like distant relatives. So it was through them that they found out that this farmhouse and this property was for sale. Jim decided that since he was getting close to retirement age anyway, that he would take his money and he would buy this farm with the thought of being, as you call it, a gentleman farmer, which was that he would have hired help do all the work and he would collect the profits. After they moved there, unfortunately, It didn't quite end up that way. The farm wasn't very prosperous, so the family ended up having to do all the work themselves. Now, you have to understand that when they first moved to the island, Jim and Margaret had two already almost grown children who stayed on the island with them really no more than just a couple of years. Then they moved back to England to start families of their own. During this period, they had a little surprise, a pleasant surprise, I guess. Margaret found herself pregnant with Vory, which is Manx for Mary. And so it was just then the three of them, Jim Irving, his wife Margaret, and then Vory, living in this farmhouse, which really was very isolated. You know, the Isle of Man, even today, is basically a rural type of island. It's an agrarian type of community with some small towns scattered here and there. And Cashin's Gap, which was the name of the farm, was even more rural than the rest of the island. It was situated on top of a very high hill. There were no direct roads to get there. You couldn't even drive a car up to the farmhouse. You had to walk about 1.5 miles up some very treacherous pathways in order to get to it. And in 1931, at this point, Vory was about 12 years old. And the story varies somewhat, but basically what happened was that they saw a small animal in the farmyard running around chasing the chickens, and it was barking like a dog, meowing like a cat, they said. It had several different vocalizations. And later, as Jim put it, it apparently had gotten into the house because they started hearing something scrabbling around in the walls. Now, of course, you know, an isolated farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, you know, you're going to get varmints.
Sure.
In the wall.
Hey, even here, just north of Toronto, we have constantly taking mice out of the cold room. But did they? How good a look at this creature in the barnyard did they get, and how would they describe it? I mean, the size and shape and so forth. What animal would it approximate?
Well, that, you know, and it's interesting that you would ask that, because that was really the only time apparently that anybody ever got a really good look at it, even after all the years of it living in the house. They said that it looked kind of like a weasel, kind of, you know, like long, maybe about the size of a good sized rat with a bushy tail. Jim said that he thought it was dark colored, but Vory insisted that it had a more of a yellowish to golden orange type of coloring. And then later on, Vory was the one who would catch better glimpses of it in the house, and then she continued to say that its color was more of like a dark yellow or to orange with a fluffy tail. But once it got inside of the house, and you have to understand, when they first moved into the house, it was a solid stone construction. So Jim had put up paneling on the inside walls to act as an insulation, which left about a 4-inch gap from the original stone walls to this wood paneling. And this was where this thing had made its home. And again, they heard it making various kinds of noises. Jim tried to poison it and trap it to no avail. So out of frustration, he said one time he barked at it like a dog, and it barked back. And that's how it started. They, you know, it kind of became a game at first. They would, you know, make various animal noises, and this thing would parrot the noises back. Eventually, it started making noises like it was attempting to mimic human speech. And remember, I mean, you know, the noises that it was making were very high pitched. That was Jeff's voice was always described as being extremely high pitched, piercing almost, you know, not coming from a human throat. Vory eventually started reading nursery rhymes, and it would repeat the nursery rhymes back. And eventually this thing developed an intelligence, a personality. who knows, how to describe it. I mean, it definitely had an intelligence all its own, but that's really how it started, from something that mimicked back animal noises to something that had full blown speech.
And at this point, I think it's important to comment on, I suppose, the character of the Irving family. You mentioned that James was a piano organ salesman, but he was an educated man. I understand he spoke several languages.
Yes, yeah, he did. He spoke, English. He spoke French, naturally. He a little Spanish, and was very proficient in Yiddish as well, and probably some other conversational languages thrown in as well. Both Margaret and James were very well educated, which really, I think, confounds a lot of skeptics when it comes to this case, because, most people in a situation like this, when they're approached with, we've got an animal that talks in our wall, they'd be like, okay, what have you been drinking? But this wasn't the Irvings at all. I mean, the Irvings at first were really confounded by what was going on. And naturally, their first inclinations was that they were dealing with a haunting of some kind. This was a ghost, and Margaret would be as bold as to ask this voice, "You're a ghost, aren't you? Just admit it." And Jack, as they first referred to it, would come back and say, "No, I'm not a ghost. I'm afraid of ghosts, in fact." Now, the voice would, at various times, I suppose, like to tease them and have fun with them, because it would say things like, what was it? I'm the spirit of a man who has come back in the form of a weasel, and I will haunt you with the clanking of chains. It also said that it was the eighth wonder of the world. It was the Holy Spirit. It was the fifth dimension. I mean, it just it said all kinds of different things. I suppose the one thing that it said that really stuck with everybody over the years was that it said that I'm nothing more than an extra special little mongoose.
Well, at what point did it identify itself as not a weasel, but a mongoose, which is, is not obviously indigenous to the Isle of Man? And
Right.
At what point did it name itself Gef with one F?
As I referred to earlier, they first had called it Jack, and not too long after that, it said that it wanted to be called Gef, and it spelled it out as Gef, which I suppose it was trying to spell out like the old spelling of Jeff, Geoff, but it said his name was Gef, Gef, and the name stuck. Eventually, it said that it had originally been born in India back in the middle 19th century. And at that point, probably around 1932 or so, it claimed to be already like more than 80 years old. And that at some point, a farmer on the island had imported a crate full of mongoose to the island in order to catch and kill the growing rabbit population. Now, the odd thing about this story is that when Jeff first told the Irvings that was news to them. They had never heard of such a thing. A year or so later, a local reporter had actually found in the archives of one of the island's newspapers this story. This had actually happened in the early 1900s. So how Jeff had found out about this, unless it was true, or else he had access to the island's archive somehow, but that's how the story stuck. That apparently he was a transplant with other non-talking mongoose to the island.
And what is the plural of mongoose? Is it mongooses or mongeese?
Some people, I don't know if anybody has really ever pinned that. It's like octopus. What's the plural of octopus? I always say just mongoose, mongoose singular, mongoose plural. Some people will say mongoose, but I think probably mongoose either way. Singular or plural is correct.
I'm gonna go with mongoose because we don't call more than one moose meese. So
right, yeah, very good.
Now, so did Gef the Talking Mongoose, did he gravitate to one particular member of the family, or was he conversant with all of them?
At first, he seemed to gravitate more towards Vori. Early on, when he first started talking, and like I said previously, the Irvings were afraid that this was some kind of haunting, and Gef really didn't help the situation because he would scream, he would curse. I guess he would curse like a sailor on shore leave. In fact, he was destructive. He created like poltergeist type of activity. He would break things. He would throw rocks and other items from little cracks in the wall. He was so loud, in fact, that visitors coming up to the house could hear, as they would put it, they could hear the animals screaming and cursing from well outside of the house. So naturally, the Irvings were afraid for their daughter, so they had moved her into their room, which really made Gef even more angry. And he threatened them. He threatened to kill them. He told them that no matter where they moved Vori, that he could find her and do whatever he wanted to with her. But eventually, things calmed down, and I guess they just kind of grew to accept that what was going on. Gef had never really done anything too damaging. He never harmed anybody. So they eventually moved Vori back into her room, and things calmed down. And for a year or so, it was Vori and Gef that were the most, talk back and forth most to each other. Gef would bring her little gifts that he claimed that he had found. It turned out later that he was stealing things from the neighbors or from the nearby town. But eventually, Gef became more and more Jim's pet isn't the word. I know a lot of people have described Gef as a pet, but you wouldn't want a pet like that. They became more and more, like a companion with each other, Jim and Gef. Right. And Jim kind of took it upon himself then to start this journal that you talked about at the beginning of the show, where and Jim actually, for almost 5 years, Jim would write down daily what Gef had did that day. And it was just they were just very like mundane notations. Gef called and killed another rabbit today. Gef said that he went to Darby and visited the bus station and heard the mechanics talk about such and such a thing. And that was the thing about Gef as well, is that Gef was a terrible gossip. Gef said that he would travel at times all over the island and then come back and tell the Irvings what their neighbors were saying, what people down at the bus station, were talking about, which didn't set very well with the neighbors. You have to understand that the Irvings were already considered outsiders. They had moved there from England. They weren't of the island. So they were already viewed somewhat with a little suspicion. Once the whole Gef situation started, that made things worse. a lot of their neighbors thought that it was a hoax of some kind, that possibly Margaret and Vory were faking it in order to try to scare Jim into selling the house and moving back to England. Which, if that was the case, it was not very successful, because Jim ended up dying there years later. But because of that, because of their outsider nature, they were, and then once the whole Gef incident started, they were viewed really with fear, disdain, kind of a combination of the two. Vory's classmates would later say that they thought that Vory was throwing her voice, that she was like this great ventriloquist or something, and was able to throw her voice out of closets or out of the back of the room or something like that.
Well, if she was capable of that, she would have given Edgar Bergen a run for his money, I would think. She would have been given her own radio show.
Yes, definitely. Well, see, back in that time, people actually thought that a ventriloquist could throw their voice, could actually, that they had learned, some kind of ability to make your voice come from a different part of the room. Now we know it's like a magician. It's a distraction. That's why you have the ventriloquist dummy. People are looking at the dummy. They don't see you moving your lips or your throat moving or things like that. Now, Vory was, I guess, pretty good at imitating animal noises. Whether or not that started before or after Gef came, it's hard to say, because a number of her classmates said that Vory was always really good at imitating animal noises, which sometimes makes me wonder, were they hearing Vory making these animal noises, or whatever Gef was in the nearby vicinity doing it for her?
Did James or Margaret talk to reporters? I mean, how did the rest of the town find out about this?
One of the local newspapers got wind of what was happening. I think it was one of their neighbors had actually had first written to Harry Price, who was the well-known, worldwide acclaimed parapsychologist in England, about what was going on. And then word got out to the local newspapers, and several reporters from various cities on the island. Towns. There are no cities, to speak of really on the island. Had come to the farm to visit, and from the local newspaper accounts, it then got out to England, France, and the rest of the world. But it started with the local newspaper accounts, which referred to Gef as the Derby man weasel. that's what he was first referred to, because it was a weasel that talked like a man.
That doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it?
No, it doesn't. Not like Gef the Talking Mongoose.
There you go. So at some point, paranormal investigator author Dandor Fordor arrives, I guess, and gets permission to stay with the family, right, on the farm.
Well, Fordor came quite a bit later. The first really investigators to come to the Irving's farm was a man by the name of Captain James McDonald, who was a friend of Harry Price, and he showed up really early on, when the phenomena was really at its peak, and in fact he got to know the Irvings quite well, and went to Cashin's Gap a number of different times. At first, Gef refused to talk. He created some poltergeist activity. He'd rapped on the walls. He threw things at McDonald from like little cracks in the wall, things like that. Eventually, though, Gef did start to talk, and McDonald recorded a number of accounts of hearing Gef talk. Oftentimes, when All three members of the family were with him so he could keep a close eye on them. Other times they would send Vori out of the house, say like out into the barnyard to gather chicken eggs. Gef still persisted in talking. One time, Captain McDonald almost managed to catch a glimpse of Gef. Gef had been active all evening, talking, singing songs, doing things like that. And they had sent Vori up into her room and had locked her door. They could lock the door from the outside to make sure that she couldn't get out. Gef then said that he was going to come down the staircase so that they could catch a quick glimpse of him. As he was coming down the staircase, and I guess that he was talking in the process, here I come, folks, that sort of thing, Captain McDonald could no longer stand it, and he jumped up and with a flashlight tried to catch Gef in mid-stride down the staircase, but Gef apparently was faster than Captain McDonald, ran up the staircase. Captain McDonald reported that he heard, tiny footsteps, running up the staircase, and then a bang, really loud bang. But by the time he got up to the landing, there was nothing there. Later, Gef told the Irvings that loud bang was Gef running up the stairs, trying to go into Vori's room, forgetting that the door was shut and locked, and him running headfirst into it. And then he, was able to do a sidestep into the darkness, so Captain McDonald didn't see him.
Right.
So that was just one of a number of different accounts of people who came to visit the farm. That Gef actually would talk, though nobody ever, not even the Irvings, with the exception possibly of Vori, were able to catch more than just a fleeting glimpse of him.
Hi, friends. If you're a fan of this podcast, or my weekly radio program, The Conspiracy Show, or my YouTube channel, Strange Planet, I hope you'll consider becoming an official donor. A donation of $50 a month places you in the Star Chamber. $20 a month is the whistleblower tier, and a donation of just $10 per month makes you a truth seeker. Star Chamber and Whistleblower members can participate in an exclusive monthly online chat or video conference with me. And all donors are entered into a monthly draw for Strange Planet merchandise. Any monthly amount is welcome and greatly appreciated. Since YouTube demonetized my channel, I need your support more than ever. To become an official donor, go to patreon.com/Strange Planet. Patreon.com/Strange Planet.
Richard has tiny talking insects living in his sock drawer. We are bugs, and we are living in Richard's sock drawer. Conspiracy Unlimited. With Richard Serrett.
Emmy-Award winning TV producer and author Tim Swartz is here, discussing the remarkable case of Gef the Talking Mongoose. It doesn't sound like this old place had electricity because you mentioned candles and so forth. So were there any attempts to take photographs or some sort of, what did they use to record back then? A dictaphone?
Yeah, there were suggestions. Harry Price, in his conversations with Captain McDonald, had asked whether or not a recording could be made. They did have dictaphones, but it required electricity. The farm had no electricity, no telephone, no radio. When I said it was isolated, it was isolated. Now they did have vans that you could actually supply electricity to, say, like a dictaphone, but there would have been no way that you could have gotten a van up to the farmhouse, as there was no road. As for photographs, Harry Price did provide Vorey with a camera and a number of plates in order to take pictures. In around 1935, Vorey did manage to capture probably 4 or 5 photographs of Gef. Gef agreed that he was going to go and run across the fence gates, at the edge of the property. And if Vorey was fast enough, she could possibly try to get pictures of him. Out of all the pictures that she took when this happened, they probably got like maybe 3 or 4. That seemed to show some kind of little furry animal, something, on this fence gate. Naturally, the skeptics are, they're like, oh well, it's a stuffed toy, it's a like a rabbit fur or something like that. So I mean, much like UFO photographs, even today, you could take as many as you want to, but it's still not going to convince the skeptics and people who don't want to believe.
And what about hair samples or? I'm thinking back to conversations with Bigfoot trackers, plaster casts of footprints.
Yep. Well, and it just goes to show you how things really haven't changed in all this time. This was back in the 1930s. So Harry Price requested the Irvings try to get hair samples from Gef. Gef agreed and left. He said that he had plucked the hairs, from his face and left them in a little bowl for the Irvings to collect and send to Harry Price. Well, when these hair samples were analyzed, they were found to have come from a dog, and in fact, the zoologist who examined this hair said that in fact it looked like hair from a sheepdog. Well, it just so happened that the Irvings had a sheepdog by the name of Mona, and later when Harry Price went to the farm himself, he gathered some hair directly from Mona, and it was the exact same kind of hair that Gef claimed that he had gathered from himself. Now, Harry Price also had sent over plastiline, which is like a clay-like substance, probably is a clay-like substance, that they requested that Gef try to make footprints and teeth prints into. Gef did. They sent it back to England. The examinations of these footprints, nobody could really come up with anything that even closely resembled these prints from the known animal kingdom. One veterinarian suggested that one footprint could have come from a raccoon. Now, one of the unique things about Gef was that his front feet were not paws, not like an animal paws. Both Margaret and Vorey had claimed that they had actually caught glimpses of Gef's front feet, and they said that they were more like little hands, like little doll hands. They had long fingers and even what appeared to be almost like an opposable thumb. One time when Gef was on top of the staircase eating a bowl of porridge that Margaret had given him, they had placed a candle up there so he could see what he was eating. And the shadow that was being projected, Gef held his hand up so they could see his shadow, and they could see what looked like little hands rather than a paw. And Gef was holding a spoon in the process, and showing what the shadows of his hands look like. Just one of the many extremely odd things about this case.
So, do you have a sense of whether Gef was a physical entity or paranormal? Because on the one hand, he there is this physicality obviously about him. Yes. But then on the other hand, he talked about, going across the island. It almost seems like he's omniscient. What do you think? Is he paranormal or physical or both?
Yeah, well, that's a little from column A, a little from column B, I would say. There there are so many aspects about the Gef event that screams of being, say, like a haunting of some kind of poltergeist. I mean, very much the things that happened in that farmhouse were like a poltergeist. The strange raps on the walls, the disembodied voices, things appearing and disappearing. But the event happened for such a long time. I mean, almost 10 years, which is almost unheard of when it comes to a traditional poltergeist. Now, Gef also, like you said, I mean, there were physical aspects to him. I mean, he would kill rabbits and bring them to the family, for them to have for dinner that night. He would steal food and eat it from the neighbors. His favorite food that the Irvings could give him would be like biscuits and chocolate. Yeah, he also liked lean bacon. There was one account where apparently he got sick after eating something and threw up. And they found later where he had vomited, and the bits of food that he had that they didn't have in the farmhouse that he had gotten someplace else. So your guess is as good as mine. There is the possibility, and this is of course just speculation. The Isle of Mann has a rich tradition of elemental types of spirits. What we would call fairies and brownies and pukas, things like that. Gef almost seems like what would have been called a house spirit. Something that exhibited both a paranormal and a physical, attributes. And like the traditional house spirit, it would help the household, but it was also extremely quick to anger. You do one little thing to make it mad, and it'll be mad at you for months. And Gef was like that. I mean, he was very temperamental. He had a temperament like a small child. So, I don't know. I mean, it just there's so much about the phenomena that makes it unique in the annals of paranormal history. We've never seen anything quite like the Gef phenomena surface, any place else in the world. So really, I mean, we're just left with speculations on what exactly happened. Now, I should say that Vori, when she left the island around 1938 to move to England, the phenomena, the voice part of it, basically stopped. I guess that there was still poltergeist type of activity occurring, but as for a personality and intelligence, that seemed to disappear once Vori left.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you think that's telling in any way?
It really does. I do think that the combined energies of the household, Margaret Irving and Vori, had something to do with allowing Gef to manifest. Whether or not this was something that was already, intelligent before this family moved, it just needed, like a little boost, some battery power, so to speak. That's hard to say, but I do find it interesting that once Vori left, that voice aspect left with her. When she was 52, a reporter for Fate magazine actually managed to track her down, and at first she refused to talk with him, but eventually she relented, and she told this reporter that everything that happened at the farmhouse actually happened, that nobody was lying. She wasn't lying. Gef actually did what everybody reported that he did. She had no idea what he was, but she wishes that Gef had never happened. She said it ruined her life, that she was forever afraid to let anybody know her real identity because she was afraid that stigma would find her, would carry on after all those years. She never married because she said, who would want to marry, the spook of Dalby? That's what everybody had called her on the island. Who would want to marry somebody like that?
It does have the. It's authentic. It sounds authentic, or she sounds very authentic.
She really does. And to me, that is really the clincher of this whole story. I mean, if we had these reports, and really for the 1930s, I mean, a lot of investigators went through a lot of trouble to go to this island and look into this and investigate it. And the majority of people came back convinced that something weird was definitely going on. But if that was all that we had, then I would say, this was probably a hoax somehow. But years later, at the age of 52, Vori had no reason to continue this. She could have just as easily have said, yeah, I was faking it. I was able to fool my parents all those years and fool everybody else that was going along. I was just a silly kid. It was all just a joke. But at the age of 52 and saying that, nope, it actually happened. I don't know what was going on, but it actually happened. She had no reason to do that. It wasn't like she was looking for publicity or money or anything like that. In fact, she wanted to be left alone. So for her to admit that the events actually occurred, really, to me, is the clincher. That convinces me that the phenomena actually happened.
Two cases kind of come to mind as I'm hearing this story, and one is the haunted house. It's been billed as the most haunted house in the world, or certainly in the United States, and that's the Bridgeport, Connecticut house. Mm-hmm. And the reason I find it interesting, the parallel there is the number of corroborating witnesses. That, even with the case in Bridgeport, you had police, you had other first responders, ambulance, firefighters, you had a priest. So it's kind of mindful of that the number of corroborating eyewitnesses to this, to me, it's just chilling, really.
Well, and don't forget, there was also supposedly there was a pet cat there that talked.
Ah. I had forgotten that. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Not as much, though, and not nearly as proficient as Gef did, but one of the father of the household, he said that one time he heard the cat coming up the top of the stairs and demanding to be fed, using some profanity in the process. But none of the reporters and nobody else could ever get the cat to talk. So, I mean, and the Bridgeport haunting, I mean, that lasted maybe, 2 weeks?
Right.
At the most?
Yes.
Yeah. While the Gef phenomena, ended probably around 1938, something like that.
Right. The other case that comes to mind is, and I think you've mentioned this, is the Bell Witch in Tennessee.
Right. Yeah, the Bell Witch probably is the closest that I could come up with something being lasting as long as Gef, and being as vocal as Gef. Now, the Bell Witch, of course, they called it a witch. It was actually more of a haunting or a poltergeist type of case. Also, like Gef, talked incessantly. Gef, one of the things that Irving's always said, that Gef, especially in the evening while they were trying to go to bed, would not shut up. He would talk sometimes up until 3 o'clock in the morning, which, if you're in a farmhouse, you're going to be getting up in just a couple hours after that. So you want the thing to, shut the hell up. It was the same thing with the Bell Witch. The Bell Witch talked constantly. She sang songs. She would repeat sermons from the local church. She also was proficient at all kinds of different vulgarities that most of the people in the household had no idea about. The other interesting thing about the Bell Witch is that occasionally she would manifest as some kind of little animal. Descriptions varied from looking like a small dog to looking like something like a cross between a fox, a rabbit, and a dog, which, is, again, similar to Gef, because there were occasions where the Irvings and visitors would see animals at the farmhouse that nobody recognized. The Irvings, Jim Irving, in fact, saw a cat one time that he didn't recognize, and Gef later said that cat was him. One time, some visitors to the farmhouse, one of the men picked up something that nobody else could see and was holding it on his lap and stroking it. And they were like, what are you doing? And he's like, well, I'm petting their cat. But nobody else could see it. And he went on to describe, this like a Manx cat, a tailless cat on his lap, and he was petting it. And again, later, Gef said, oh, well, that was me. So again, here we are back to that. Was Gef some kind of paranormal entity or a physical creature? Well, I mean, he seemed to have the abilities to that really scream paranormal. Again, much like the Bell Witch. The Bell Witch could physically attack people. She was well known for slapping people across the face, though nobody could see what was slapping them, scratching them, spanking. She would beat the children, apparently, and again, this was an event that lasted for a number of years.
Whatever happened to Cashin's Gap, the house, I mean?
After the Irvings moved, Jim Irving died in 1945, and then Margaret, with the help of her oldest daughter, Eloise, who was living in England, they sold the house and moved back to England. Now, the new owner, a couple of years later, told newspaper reporters that he had actually killed some kind of strange animal on his farm. He said that he had caught it in his trap and that it was extremely vicious, and he clubbed it to death. He took a picture of it, but the picture has since disappeared, though apparently the reporter for Fate magazine had it, and he showed the picture to Vorey when he interviewed her in 1970, and she said that picture looked nothing like Gef. The picture apparently showed a larger black and white animal, probably a skunk, is from the description is what I would say it is. But she said it looked nothing like Gef. Eventually, the farmhouse in the middle to late 1970s was torn down. And now, I mean, the property is owned by somebody else, but there's no longer any remnants of the farmhouse. Some writers have speculated that the owner tore the house down to stop, tourists from coming and trying to track the place down. I find that unlikely because in the island of Mann right now, the Gef is almost completely forgotten about. A local brewery had brewed a beer a few years ago called Gef the Talking Mongoose Ale. But other than that, most people no longer remember the case.
Well, and thanks to you and your team, you perhaps have saved this fascinating story from oblivion. You really have to be, we have to thank you for that, and thank you for bringing it to our attention, Tim.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Like I said before, myself and Timothy Green Beckley especially have been fascinated by this case for years, and we really wanted to find more information about it because, a lot of the books that have written about this case, it's just been, really no more than just a couple of pages worth of information. And as we discovered, there's just so much more out there that hadn't been seen in so long, and I imagine that there's probably additional information that is sitting in somebody's archive someplace. That I'm hoping that now that this book is out, somebody will see it and say, "Oh yes, I remember seeing this," And, maybe additional information will come out. I would love to see that.
Oh, absolutely. Tim, where can we get a copy of Gef the Talking Mongoose?
Sure. Well, it's available quickly at Amazon.com. You can get the physical book and an ebook version. Check your local bookstore. It's available at most popular bookstores. If they don't have it, ask for it. You can find it on our bookstore, the conspiracyjournal.com bookstore. But if you, like I said, Amazon probably is the quickest way to get a hold of it.
Tim, thank you so much for this.
My pleasure, Richard. I had a great time talking with you, and I hope your listeners enjoyed it as well.
Okay, before I dim the lights in my little studio beneath the stairs, I'll be back in a flash to tell you what's coming up next on Conspiracy Unlimited.
Hey, this is Tony Merkel, host of The Confessionals, a blog talk radio podcast that brings you weekly interviews with eyewitness accounts of strange and unexplained events. From paranormal activity to UFO encounters to Bigfoot sightings, step into The Confessionals as we explore mysterious, real-life stories. Check us out on your favorite podcast app or theconfessionalspodcast.com. And many thanks to Conspiracy Unlimited for having me on the air. I'll see you all on The Confessionals.
Next time on Conspiracy Unlimited, media scientist Nelson Thal says the Queen is dead, England has surrendered to the new American Patriot movement, and Canada will soon join the United States in a continental government.
Long before her death, there were petitions being made to the House of Lords, because the House of Lords is the one who chooses and decides on who's to be the new monarch. By the time the Queen started to hit age 80, the House of Lords have had lawyers from the Windsors, lawyers from the Hanovers, lawyers from the Stuarts, petitioning them to point out that they have a first claim or they have a second claim or whatever. And certainly the Hanovers are the ones with the primary claim.
Until next time, I'm Richard Serrett. So long for now.